Daniel. Thanks to DigitalGov folks. And this is Alan Atlas here. And yep, we're back for the fourth class, second in our series about Scrum. We talked about the basics of Agile first in a couple classes, and now we're going to finish up talking about Scrum today. I'm hoping for a couple of interesting slides as we get near the end. And I want to encourage you to put questions into the chat channel, and Brouilette will do his unbelievably useful and excellent and professional job of sorting them and getting them to me throughout. We won't wait till the end for Q&A. And once again, I've tried to cut down the deck to give us more time for questions and discussion. So don't hesitate, and we'll take it as it goes and see what happens. So thanks very much, and off we go. Last time we talked about the Agile development model. We talked about the Scrum process framework for probably the third time, the product backlog, the product owner, user stories, and we spent a little bit of time on the delivery team, on the Scrum team. Today, what we'll essentially go through is some in-depth look and in a little tiny bit of depth at each of the sprint ceremonies. We'll talk about sprint planning. We'll talk about what the team does, what goes on during the sprint, which is kind of, oh, by the way, building the product, and also a couple of different meetings, the grooming meeting and the daily Scrum. We'll talk about the sprint review and the sprint retrospective, and go over some benefits and a few other topics at the very end. So that will fill us up for the day. So let's talk about sprint planning. It's where the sprint or the iteration, depending on, you can call it either one. It's where the sprint starts. It's not a very complicated meeting in the sense that it has a very well-defined goal, which is just to get the team to agree on what they're going to work on together during the sprint. And a quick reminder, because it's a subtle nuance that people forget. So I'll probably try to mention it every chance I get. This is a self-organizing team. No one is in charge, but rather than turning into anarchy, what it turns into is a situation of shared empowerment and shared responsibility amongst the team. But when there's no one pointing at people and giving orders, you all have to agree on what's going on. And we start doing that for a 2-week sprint by agreeing on the stuff that the team is actually going to work on. It's a very simple process. We have certain inputs into the process. Some people will list a whole bunch more, but I think it's reasonable to break it down into the fairly simple product backlog. That is, and we've talked about it before, the product backlog being a list of the pieces, the items of customer value the team can build, and it's in priority order, as determined in the end by the product owner, with lots and lots of help and input from other folks, including the team. We have our velocity history, that is the team's knowledge of how it does work, how much it can do, and what its style is, and so forth, that sort of thing. A lot of that comes from this idea that it's a stable and long-lasting team, so people get to learn to work with one another well, and start to take advantage of synergies and of their ability to understand what each other needs in order to succeed. And then finally, everything else. What the team's up to, what are the world circumstances, do we have electricity this week, how are we for vacations, training, how's the marketplace, what other major events are happening. All of those things get kind of put into the hopper, and the team exuberantly and forthrightly and in a straightforward, candid way works together to come up with this agreement on what they're going to work on. Because again, no one's going to tell them. So if they don't do this, then what you'll have is 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 people going off in different directions. And the idea here is, of course, we get much more done if we're all heading for the same goal. So with all of that effort, the outputs from this meeting are simply going to be, at a minimum, a commitment, a forecast, a focus, some agreement on what the team is going to be concentrating on for this sprint. And there are some specifics that some teams will use and some teams won't. We won't get to talk about them in detail, but I'll mention them a little bit and of course respond to questions. There is something called a task breakdown that many teams will produce that often goes along with something called a capacity plan for teams that do what's called capacity-based sprint planning. It's actually a bit more formal than most teams that I've seen go through. Some teams use it to their advantage, particularly useful for teams that are new to Scrum and don't really have a feel for how they're working. There is something called the sprint backlog, which is this detailed breakdown of the work the team is going to do. It started as a top few items on the product backlog, and now we've broken them down into a way that will facilitate the team's work. And oftentimes a team will choose a sprint goal, which is something other than complete all the stories we wanted to do. And the sprint goal might be something like, finally achieve everything we need to release this to our biggest customer, or finally get this into the production environment. For it could be any thing that goes sort of over and above an individual story. So just all of these different pieces help the team understand their work and help them work together to achieve what it is they want to do. Sprint planning is a fairly straightforward exercise. It's built around a two-step process. There's step one and step two, so it's not really a complicated thing, but it does give you a sort of repeatable, not quite mechanical, but at least structured way for a team to attack this problem. So in part one, we involve the product owner to a pretty large degree, and we take a look at kind of the big picture. Where are we right now? What does the product backlog look like? Any surprises on it since the last time we all sat down and looked at the product backlog together? How are we doing in terms of our release plan or our roadmap? Those are sort of the governing longer-term views that a team wants to keep in mind so that they're constantly making progress for their longer-term and larger goals. Often teams will plan for a quarterly release or a release for a longer period than just a sprint, and that typically means a special release to customers rather than the creation of working software at the end of each sprint. So we spend part one kind of getting everybody oriented. Part one for a team that is really clicking on all cylinders, part one can take 10 minutes, maybe even less. And we'll go into the reasons for that later as we go through what happens during the sprint. But this is kind of an orientation part of the meeting. The rest of the meeting is devoted to the team. And I've coached teams in the past to where, for whatever reason, helping overburdened product owners sometimes, the product owner actually doesn't even need to be there for part two of sprint planning. It's always helpful if they are. But a good team that's been doing all of their sort of Scrum practices well can get along and do a fairly good job at sprint planning without even having the product owner available for part two, because really part two is all about the team sitting down and talking about how they're going to do the work. And if you remember when we talked about the definition of a self-organizing team, what's important is that we leave the question of how they will do the work and who will do the work and how it will be staged and all of the details of how those commitments will be made. We leave those to the Scrum team, to the developers, the deliverers on the team. We let them do their work because they're the professionals. We let them do it according to their best judgment. So this is the part of the meeting where the real stuff happens. The team gets down to a detailed understanding of the work. They talk about whether the stories are really ready to be worked on. They might spend some time breaking a story down into multiple tasks. Lots of discussion around things. This is often where some of the pitfalls and the risks for the sprint come up in the discussion, and it's up to the team to decide what to do with them. And the output of this is the output of the sprint planning meeting, which is now 20 years into Scrum, I guess it is. Now, some people call this a focus. Some people call this a commitment. Some people call it a forecast or a prediction. It started off being treated as a commitment, and that actually led to a bunch of dysfunctional behavior. So it's changed over the years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the beginning. A guideline, you really wouldn't want to be spending more than an hour of planning for a week's worth of work for a team. And most teams that I work with usually do sprint planning for a 2-week sprint in an hour once they get going and they have everything working well.
Got a question on that topic, Professor, from Chris, who we are going to see if they have audio. Chris, go ahead.
I am trying. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, yay. Great. I found the unmute button. Yes, I was just wondering, is the 1 hour max, is that the meeting itself with the team, or is that the work that the Scrum Master puts into deciding what's done when and prioritizing things? Does that make sense?
Well, it does. I need to unpack it a little bit because you crammed 2 or 3 things in there. So yes, it's about the meeting itself, because that's the most highly leveraged thing and the thing that causes that can be abused. If you take 8 people and put them in a room and you spend an extra hour there, that's one entire person day, more than a person day actually, that you've lost to productivity. So it's really key that for the times that the team is together, you're really careful and efficient in what you're doing. Somebody's not muted out there, and if you could be careful to mute, that'll probably help everybody a little bit. The Scrum Master doesn't do an awful lot outside of this, but all of the product backlog work is something that the team under the leadership of the product owner does. The Scrum Master will facilitate this meeting and make sure it moves along, and make sure the team sort of doesn't forget important things. But there's not a tremendous amount of preparation as long as the product backlog is kept in good shape.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm going to move on. I have no idea what's next. Oh, exactly. I knew this was coming soon. So let me just jam for a minute on this idea of commitment versus forecast versus prediction. And I'll also throw in estimation just to confuse everybody. In the beginning, it used to be an important thing that a Scrum team committed to a certain set of stories, and that commitment extended to the idea that, and a lot of people got this wrong, that sort of if you said you were going to do 8 stories and you identified which 8 they were, and you didn't do all 8, that you were bad and that you had a failed sprint. You only did 7 or 6 of them. And it was sort of upsetting to people, even if you did 9 or 10, because it wasn't exactly 8 and you didn't get it exactly right. And people, for the wrong reasons, started to try to keep track of whether or not, of how close the team was to their prediction. And there was a metric, and we'll end up talking about that a little bit later too, about how many stories that the team started but never completed during the sprint, and also a metric about how close you were. I forget if it was called work not done, something like that. We committed to 8, we did 6, so we got a 75% or something like that. Anyway, that turned out not to be good because it started to bring back old dysfunctional waterfall behaviors, like people would be up late the last 2 nights before the end of the sprint to try to get stuff done. People would start to do bad behaviors about sandbagging on estimates and picking and choosing stories so that they would make their commitment rather than worrying more about sort of what was the best thing for them to build and develop for the product and for the customer. So over time, that changed to become a forecast, which is how many do you think you'll get done, or a prediction, how many do you think you'll get done? The idea here being a much more wholesome one based on trust, right? We trust that the team is going to do their best work. We just flat out do. It's very, very difficult for an entire team to sandbag. It requires a huge conspiracy. And most of the people that we work with, I'm sure you'd agree, are generally motivated and like to succeed and like to do their best work. So this seems to hold pretty well. So once we agree that the team is going to do its best work, then it becomes more like, well, how many stories do we need to really look at closely in sprint planning to make sure we've got enough to be ready to work on? And, so, all right, we'll predict we're going to do 8. We'll feel fine if we do 6, because that will obviously be the most we could have done, because we're working at our best all along. And if we finish 8 early, we can always go back to the top of the backlog and pull in the next story or the next one after that if we need more work. So there's really no damage done if you don't have a hard and fast commitment and don't meet it. What's more damaging is if you do less work because you're trying to meet a commitment, or you do poorer quality work, or you feel like you failed when you've actually succeeded. If you're worried about hitting this number exactly. There was a notion that if your process and your team were really good, you ought to be able to nail that, but that sort of was succumbing to an old waterfall myth that you really understood exactly, up front you understood how things would go and how much work things would take and all of that. Part of this process is the idea of estimation. People used estimation to try to help them make a good commitment. It turns out in Scrum, and we're not going to talk about this in depth today very much at all, but there are 2 different kinds of estimation. There's task estimation and story estimation. Neither of them turn out to be particularly useful, and yet teams used to invest tremendous amounts of time trying to do them correctly. Even if you could do them well, and very few teams could, you didn't get any extra. Nothing good happened from that, really. So over time, a movement sprung up, and full disclosure, I'm a full dues paid member of the no estimates camp, and we just don't see any value coming from doing these estimates. We will do some measurement, but we won't do any estimates on that. So people used to do these estimates in order to try to sort of nail these meaningless targets. So forecast, prediction, whatever you like, just don't behave badly. Don't stay up late trying to finish the right number of stories. Just do your best work, and the right amount of work will get done, and we'll be fine. All right, so what happens during the sprint? We all make it out of the sprint planning meeting with hopefully very few injuries. And during the sprint is when the team really makes its money. And this is where the Scrum Master often comes to the fore. Scrum Master is a new and interesting role in terms of development. It just didn't exist before. The Scrum Master is not a manager. The Scrum Master is what we call a servant leader. That is, they have no power. They are a peer. They're not a manager, but they're a peer of the people on the team. Their only goal is to make the team successful, and a good Scrum Master will do pretty much anything to help a team succeed. And so they do things like arranging for meetings, arranging for resources from outside of the team. They facilitate meetings. They also serve as a change agent. They're there to suggest to people on the team and outside of the team when changing processes, changing culture could make a difference in terms of the teams being able to do its work. And they have 2 primary focuses. What's that? Foci. They concentrate on 2 specific things in their Scrum Master role. One is that they are meant to be the process champion. The Scrum Master is the person who's supposed to really understand Scrum. And that part of their job means that they're there when the team sort of innovates itself right out of the Scrum process by accident. Scrum Master is there to help get them back between the rails, or back on the rails, I should say. So they're often looked at as sort of the arbitrator and the Scrum police in some sense, and that's not really the best description of the role, but they are there to be the ones who really understand in depth what are the best ways to do the various practices and ceremonies that you need to do. What are some ideas about how to improve them? And the team will look to them for that sort of knowledge. The other thing that the Scrum Master is there for is to be the obstacle remover. And this comes back to servant leadership. They are there to get any obstacle that is holding the team back out of the way. And that could be a lack of information, could be a lack of resources. It could be interference from outside of the team. It could be any of a number of things that would cause the team to work less productively than they might. So it's a really kind of an all-around role, very poorly, it's not defined sort of in detail. It's just defined in terms of the spirit of the thing. And some people really get it, and it turned out to be outstanding Scrum Masters. Some people don't get it at all. And when you're not a very good Scrum Master, your team will suffer. And you might not notice it because it's very hard to compare, but it is true that there are good and bad Scrum Masters. And I will say, I'll share with you some old Scrum instructor wisdom, because the question often gets asked, how many teams can a Scrum Master handle? And the answer that people have favored over the years is that a good Scrum Master can handle 2 or maybe 3 teams well, and a great Scrum Master can handle 1. Because it does turn out to be an all-encompassing, consuming kind of a job. We got anything, Brouilette?
My addition there, we have no questions, believe it or not, so you're being very thorough. My addition on the idea that the Scrum Master is a new role would just be that it is a new named role. The really successful teams have always had someone in that role. They just usually think of them as a person where, we don't know what Dave does or Lisa does, but everything runs better when they're here. So you've probably got on a high-performing team that isn't a Scrum team yet, you've got your Scrum Master. You just haven't identified them formally.
Okay. So
we do have a question. Dawn McCluskey, go ahead.
Go.
Hello. So I heard you loud and clear on the estimation point. No pun intended there. Sorry. The question that I have is about things being more of a rabbit hole than you expected, taking longer than expected, versus scope creep, and kind of where does one draw the line between, okay, we're going to call this effort, this discrete effort done, and now we'll put off part 2, or wow, this is just more complicated and we need to spend more time on it than we originally thought. In one hand, you could say we underestimated, so we find that we have old code, mature code, I should say. And so things are often a lot more complex than we might have imagined. So we're just kind of trying to figure out what's a good way to handle these cases.
Sure. Let's see. Several parts to the scope story and to the question that you're asking about. I guess the first part of the answer is that there's a kind of a rule of thumb. There's a Scrum rule of thumb. Not going to go any further with that. But the rule is no gold plating. And so one of the first things that's difficult sometimes for engineers, for developers to understand is that you only do whatever the user story says. You don't do more, because even though you're going to be working on it 2 days from now, you don't do any more because you're in the same code, or you have a really good idea about how to do it, or it would be easier overall if you combined 7 stories into one and just worked all together in one place. You work a story at a time. And one of the benefits of that is that it gives the team a chance to do something called story splitting, which has to do, another thing we won't have a chance to go into today. Story splitting is the idea that you can pick and choose, maybe not how big on an absolute scale a story is, but you can always make stories smaller by splitting them. and there are vanishingly few cases where you can't once you get the art of how to do that. So the way to avoid the situation that you're talking about, I think it was Dawn, is working with smaller and smaller stories. Over time with a team, there should be almost no penalty, no overhead to doing something as one story or 3 stories, because it shouldn't take any extra time to do a separate story. But it does give me the possibility of making things smaller and smaller. And so I complete a story, I complete another story, I complete another story, and I have much less chance of getting it to something that's too big. And I know that for a lot of teams, generating the awareness so that during sprint backlog grooming and sprint planning, people are constantly saying, is there a way to split this story? Is this story too big? Is this story likely to bite us? Is there something unknown in this story? Teams will eventually start to try to pay attention to that. And the best defense is lots and lots of small stories rather than one big one. And it's just it's sort of getting used to that way of working. It's easy once you get the hang of it. It's really uncomfortable and bizarre when a team first starts down that road.
Yeah, thank you.
And excuse me, Don, when you talk about self-organization here, Doc, the question is sitting in the channel, though I think you're about to get to it. Who assigns the tasks to the team members?
Easy answer, the team members. So it's normally the case, it's up to the team who does the work. And what's normally the case is that I pick the task that I want to work on. That's kind of cool, because in general, that would mean one of 2 things. Either I'll usually be working on something I really want to work on, so I'll work better, or I will feel very noble because I will have picked something that needs to get done for the good of the team. And so I'll be feeling, I'll have my little halo on while I'm doing my work for that. And people will do them for lots of other motivations, but no one assigns them. Sometimes a team will say, gosh, that is a great task for our new person who happens to be a new college hire. How do you want to take that one? Or they might say, this is really, really serious and it's making me afraid. And let's all turn to sort of the oldest grizzled veteran coder on the team and ask them to take this one because we're really afraid of it. Those things all happen, but they're all up to the team as a team, and sort of on a day-to-day basis, it's mostly about people assigning tasks to themselves. All right.
Let's keep moving a little bit, and I'll let some questions queue here. Go
okay. On. Not going to talk a lot about the daily scrum. The purpose of the daily scrum is self-organization. The purpose of the daily scrum is not status. So it's about planning your day. It's about the team getting together and looking at which things are hard, which things are easy. How are they going to meet their goals? How are they continue to get to the best sprint results possible? It's meant to be a short meeting, 15 minutes. It should be sort of the daily heartbeat of the team. And it's a very simple format for everybody. What did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what's blocking me? What impediments do I have? And when everybody goes through that, the team should have a really good idea of what work is being done that day, that everybody is still aligned on the same goals, the same set of stories, and where you're making progress and where you have things to worry about. The Scrum Master's top task list, if they happen to be a working Scrum Master who also codes or designs or does other work for the team, the Scrum Master first goes to work on the impediments, the blockers that people have reported, so they can make sure that the rest of the team is free and able to work before they start on their own stuff. So that happens every day. The other big characteristic of a Scrum team is called swarming. And this is the idea that rather than have individuals work on stories all by themselves, we like to have multiple people work on stories to get them done as quickly as possible. So we will always choose 3 people or 2 or 3 or 4, however many people, to work on a story and get it done in half a day, rather than one person taking 2 days to work on the story. There are a lot of fairly good and obvious benefits to doing that. Lots and lots of synergy, lots and lots of knowledge sharing, lots and lots of multiple eyes on the code. So it is the style in which good Scrum teams work. This whole team thing really gets a little bit boring, but it's true. It permeates everything a Scrum team does, and there are lots and lots of benefits to working that way. So it's worth mentioning swarming. In fact, I often, there is the Tuckman model of team formation, and some of you have heard the forming, storming, norming, performing stages of high performance team development. I slightly changed that for Scrum. It never got famous, so it must not be very good, but I still like it anyway. I like to say in Scrum that it's forming, storming, norming, and swarming. And that's really when you know that you've gotten a Scrum team up to peak performance, when they're good at swarming. The other meeting that we have during the sprint is called Backlog Grooming meeting. The purpose of this meeting is to make sure that our governing document, our midterm planning document, the backlog, is in good shape, because everything depends on the backlog being in good shape in terms of the team being able to run a productive sprint. There's only a few things that we do during backlog grooming. One is that we look at stories and we understand them. We then, as a team, including the product owner, of course, we look at stories and we tweak prioritizations. If we're a team that does estimation, we do our estimations during backlog grooming. We can split stories during backlog grooming, go from one to multiples. We might even do the most important thing there is for backlog grooming, which is delete stuff, take it right off the backlog. So it's all about grooming. It's all about making sure the backlog is clear and clean and ready for the next sprint planning meeting, with particular emphasis then on the top of the backlog where the highest priority items are, because that's where we're going to concentrate when we get into planning for the next sprint. So most teams will do one of those meetings per sprint. Team I'm working with now has chosen to do two, and it's because they needed it. They started with one and they just needed more, and it's all working quite smoothly. So, if your team needs to do that, that's just fine. So backlog grooming has come into Scrum sort of later in the game. It wasn't there at the very beginning, but it turned out to be a really good addition, and almost all teams do it now, I should say. Another big activity during the sprint is acceptance. Acceptance is when the team thinks that it has completed a user story and it's ready to deliver, or it's ready to sort of check off. And that means that it has met the definition of done. It meets the description of functionality or value in the story. It meets all of the acceptance criteria. And when you're done, this is when you show it to the product owner. You might demonstrate it or whatever works for you and your team. And the product owner will say, yep, check, done, accepted, move on to the next one. This brings up this idea of the definition of done, which is sort of a standard of excellence, if you will, for the team to be able to say, we're done with this story. This avoids is one of the many pieces of the quality story in Scrum that we don't get to go into at this level either. But one of the things is that there are certain things that all stories will meet up to. This is a sort of overly basic definition of done, but the stories will be code complete. They'll be fully tested, which in a Scrum environment usually means has a complete set of automated tests. There's no known bugs in the story. It's fully checked in and integrated, and it's been tested in the official test environment. Most people now are used to this idea of staging environments and pre-production environments and all of that. So you don't run into the kind of thing we used to run into years ago, where somebody would get something tested and working on in their own personal individual development environment on their own machine, and they'd say they were done, but it turned out that they were only like 10% done, because all the work had to do with moving that into the main environment and integrating it and testing it and all of that. So in order to get past that stuff, we have this idea in Scrum of the definition of done. the team is expected to meet it on all stories, and the product owner is allowed to assume that the team has met it when they come for acceptance. Little dose of reality on top of that. The definition of done is always a little bit more complicated, and it's always tailored to your environment and your team. Once they start paying attention to it, it will rapidly grow, but it also rapidly becomes kind of reflex for the team.
Doc, if you can bump back one slide, we have a question specific to this one. Again, Chris. Chris, unmute and go ahead.
Sorry, I had to hit both buttons. Yes, I was just trying to understand. It seems like the 5th bullet here, where it's tested in an official test environment, is sort of a subset of what fully tested means. Is that, or is there some other distinction that this is trying to make?
So fully tested really means I've written all the tests to test all the code. Tested in the official test environment means that I've put all of that stuff into the repository. We've done a complete build. We've then deployed that build to the official pre-production environment and run all of the tests there. So it's sort of two parts of the same concept. One is we have all the tests, we know how to test what we have, and the official test environment one is where to test it. And what it really means is not on your own personal server, but fully integrated with the entire system, out in our carefully managed pre-production environment.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Excuse me. David Fern wants to know if that includes automation testing.
It assumes automation testing. In fact, in Scrum, the exception should be manual testing, and I know that it has to happen. There's a quick discussion we could have about why that's true, but yeah, it absolutely assumes automated testing.
Elaine has a question about the definition of done also. Mm-hmm. Elaine, go ahead.
Hey, Alan.
Hi.
You have could you tweak this definition for non-developmental type tasks?
No. Quite. And the reason is because, and this is where it's so hard to do this outside of software, because it would be different I can't tweak it here for a sort of general non-software situation, but you could on your team. It requires understanding what the purpose of the basic definition of done is, and then kind of working your way through and incrementally over time coming up with what do we mean when it's really done. I can imagine in a content creation environment, one thing about the definition of done is it's actually been produced in our 4 standard languages. A random example, but that just makes that a sort of, yes, we always do that. And you're not done when you've written the paragraph, but you can start to think about being done when you've written the paragraph and then translated it into the other languages, if you see the difference there.
Does that mean that one common feature over, like if you're doing it in non-development type work, is that you can see, it's like there's something tangible, there's a tangible quality to the thing that's been created, or is that not always the case? And in terms of how you adopt this?
What we would, so the thing you're trying to produce in a non-software environment is some value to give to the customer. And I'm not coming up with anything that's intangible, but I can imagine it's possible. Maybe it's a process, but usually there'd be like a process documentation or something. Offhand, nothing comes to mind, but you really want to center on it. It's the equivalent of, we always produce some working software that does something when we're doing software-based Scrum. So we would always try to produce something that is visible and done in some way if we're doing non-software based Scrum. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's keep rolling here. I've got some questions queued for later.
Okay. End of sprint, not end of discussion. At the end of sprint, we've got 3 things going on. We have potentially shippable software, we have the sprint review, and we have the sprint retrospective. This is the time when in Scrum terms, the saying is always inspect and adapt. You build something, you inspect it, and then you change as you need to in order to make things better. So, and this kind of applies to everything in Scrum, and you'll hear it with old Scrum veterans. You'll hear it all the time. So we have the potentially shippable product increment. It's working software or some kind of a partial product or a complete product that's going to give some value to customers. We want to have this informal look at it. In software-based Scrum, you're doing the demo. People call it the demo. You want to show people what features you have built during the previous 2 weeks and how they fit, and talk about how they work and whatever you need to do. It's meant to be informal. It's meant to be interactive. Again, sort of 1 hour per sprint kind of a time investment. Some teams spend a lot of time trying to stage it and plan it up front. It shouldn't be that way. You really ought to have your product there and just use those particular features. Explain to your audience what it is and why it's great and what it's doing. And there's all kinds of benefits from this exercise. We like to have lots of people invited. Sprint reviews without strangers present are much less useful. It's really important to have some stakeholders, some other teams, some customers or users of some kind there. It just makes for a better interaction. You'll get lots of sort of dumb questions, which are usually the most embarrassing ones for you. The vibe is just much healthier, much more pleasant. So sprint review is a kind of an important thing. Things are demoed within the context of being fully integrated working product at some point. So this is where we say we inspect and adapt the product, and hopefully we're going to get some feedback. Not the only feedback we'll ever get from outside of the team, but we do want to get some feedback from the demo and take back and say, we need to add a story to do this. We don't have to do this other story. We need to, change some features in here, or whatever it happened to be that came up during the demo. It's a great source of feedback for the team. Feedback is usually most cogent, most effective when it comes from outside of the team. And then we have sort of the biggie, the retrospective, where we look back and we try to answer the question, how could we have done better? Retrospectives so they're governed by this idea in Scrum of safety, and that's why they're traditionally limited. A retrospective is limited in attendance to just the team. No managers, no stakeholders, no outsiders, Scrum Master, product owner, and delivery team all together in a room. Everybody agrees that we're there not to place blame, right? We're there to learn to work together better, to try to improve something, to make our own lives better, and to make the quality of our product and the amount of value we ship to customers better and larger, more up and to the right always. So this is kind of different from traditional postmortems and learning sessions and things. Also because it's meant to be on the small scale. It's thinking about 2 weeks worth, and it's meant to be sort of ongoing within the team. So we're thinking about what can we do in the next 2 weeks to do a little bit better, or the next 2 weeks after that. And we do it on an incremental basis, not trying to think, well, how could we have done the last 9-month project better? And coming up with a long list of things that we'll never implement to make it work. This used to be done always in a sort of face-to-face closed door meeting, except that of course the way we work, we're most often distributed. So I wanted to share with you a retrospective document that's working really well for one particular team, just to take you through kind of, because I know there's interest in this, kind of how this particular team looks at their retrospectives and how they do them in a distributed environment. And this actually works pretty well. So this is you can see this is for Sprint 96. So that's like, 4 years of of work for this team. This method has been developing over 4 years. About a year ago, I joined the team as coach, and we took what was there at the time and changed it a lot and ended up with this particular format that I'm going to show you on this and on the next slide. So I'll just take you through it. How are our changes working? The first thing the team does, and they've already done, by the way, at this point, is sprint review. They know what's been completed. They know what their velocity is. They've already made it through the whole sprint, and this is the last thing that happens as part of a sprint. And they will, because every sprint, every retrospective, they have one or two suggestions for how to go further, for things to change, to improve over time. They keep track of them by putting them up into this section. And each time we get to a sprint retrospective, they say, well, what about this one? Did we do it? Did it work? Was it good? Is it in there? Should we keep paying attention to it, or is it like locked in and we're just going to keep doing it? And so as things are retired from this list, that means that they've sort of taken their place within the team's processes, and that's what the strike-throughs are. So at the beginning of the meeting, no things will have the strike through, and as the team discusses each one, they'll say, do we need to continue talking about this, or is it cool? If it's cool, they strike through. We don't have to, it won't show up in this paragraph at the next sprint. But the things that are not strike throughs, those will show up next time. Metrics are worth mentioning a little bit. Metrics are meant to help the team improve. They're not KPRs. They're not OKIs. Okay, whatever those things are. Okay,
whatever they are, they're not that.
That's true. And we expect them to change over time, but they're really useful. So you can see this team does not do estimation, and they count their velocity by stories completed. And their average is about 16. And in this particular sprint, they were right on average. They're also tracking stories started but not finished, because those can be a source of wasted work. If I have 12 stories started but not finished, that probably could have turned into 2 or 3 stories completed if the team had been more focused and careful in how they did their work. So they've been tracking that for a while. And you can see the value in this sprint versus the rolling average over the past. This team does 5. They also ran into a problem for a while where their PRs were just incredibly long-lived. These are in hours. And they just taken right out of GitHub. They did not like it, and it was getting in their way and clogging up the sprint. So they just started to watch these things, and as they did, the numbers have come down. The sprints have gotten more and more effective over time. And something that's just come up recently was a quality issue where they were starting to get a lot of bugs reported against code that they had said was fine, and that had made it out of a sprint, right? So they've got this bugs reported against deployed code. You can see by the rolling average that in the past, it was up pretty high, and it's certainly come down for a while. So part of this is just once you put a metric in there, you end up paying attention to it, and any good team will figure out a way to improve it. But these are kind of useful things that have helped this team get going, and they've developed this over time. Every team likes to do a "What did we do well?" section. You never really find any gold in there, but teams enjoy it, and it makes people feel better. So, okay, fine. So moving down the document, then they start to get into discussion of what could we do better next time. And now these sections tend not to be filled in at the beginning of the retro, and the document is up on Google Drive, and everybody kind of fills things in as they go. So this all fills in as the discussion happens in real time. What could we do better next time? A whole bunch of suggestions about what things we might possibly do. Those are slowly filtered through the discussion into a smaller set of what could we actually implement after this retro. And you'll notice that these are very, very specific, and it took a while for the team to get the idea that what should we implement after this retro is not things like everybody should feel bad if they pick more than one story at a time. But it's really specific, like there's a rule that says, right, or we will check every day, we will ask the question in the daily scrum, something like that, that's much, much more specific. And then you can see the pluses at the end of these, where at the end of the meeting, the team voted and they'll pick the top 2 to implement. Those 2 will show up in the top, how are our changes doing? The Scrum Master will try to make sure that they actually get implemented in the upcoming sprint. And so that, go ahead.
No, thank you. It is, I wanted to caution everybody, it is strongly tempting to treat retros, and 18F is terrible, outright unqualified terrible at this. Do not treat retros simply as a matter of grievance resolution. You should do your retros on after the best sprint you have. That's going to be a valuable retro. There is a tendency on the part of most teams when adapting to this methodology to, we're going to need a retro about this, to be something someone who has lost an argument mutters darkly. And if you do this when everybody's happy and great, that's how you learn to improve things when you have a turbulent sprint. So by all means, retro hygiene is something you really want to buckle down on and keep in mind.
Thank you.
Well,
I thought I would throw in a bonus slide, a little bit about just a picture to talk about the way we think about planning in Scrum, where planning means release dates and feature scope and things like that. So what I've envisioned here is a product backlog, remembering that if we were in the waterfall world, we would simply say we're going to do all of those things, and then we would write giant specs and have teams and do all that stuff and try to do them all and get some fraction of them done at unpredictable levels of quality at some date later than the one we wanted. But instead, in Scrum, the way we think about this is that we have a velocity, and velocity is a measurement. It's not a wish. You'll notice that team that we just went through in retrospective, they reported their velocity, and you can do statistics about it. And if they have a velocity history, and they can tell you their average velocity over time, they can tell you sort of their best sustainable velocity and their worst sustainable velocity from history. And so they can take a look at their product backlog, and they can say things like, 2 months from now, we're going to be at our average velocity, we'll be about here. And you can see I've indicated that. It's the middle arrow on this picture. Because all sort of planning of this type in Scrum is all about locating a place on the product backlog and associating it with a time. The place on the product backlog being the scope. Everything above it is done. That's what we're including in our release, and everything past it is not done. If we have a really, really bad bunch of sprints, we might go slow enough that we'll only get about halfway down this list. If things go really, really well, we get a bunch of really easy stories to do, no surprises, we might get so fast as to get nearly through this entire list for whatever time period we're talking about. And if you keep in mind that at the top of this list is where the important stuff is, because remember, it's in priority order, and the further down the list you go, the less important each story is, then we have this idea that we can essentially pick our scope by deciding when to stop, because every sprint we do more and more of these stories, and we can trade off time versus impact, because we can say, well, we're really down into the weeds now in the stuff that we're creating, the stories that we're doing. So why don't we just wrap it up and ship it? Which is a little bit different than, hey, a customer said this would solve a problem for them. That this would typically lead to a much earlier shipment. Like, just give them this much and then continue on. But this is the picture that you have in your head when you're talking about planning formal releases outside of a team for general use. And it's this idea with confidence intervals, you'll notice. It's this idea that we will simply march down the product backlog at a predictable and measurable pace. And at the end of every sprint, we will have working and tested software, and we can simply choose when the trade-off is right for us, the trade-off being time against scope.
So does that mean that in a backlog, each backlog item takes roughly the same amount of time?
Yes, because this is, all of these stories are stories that were of the right size to fit into a sprint. So that means that while they're not all identical, they're all of a certain class, right? There's a bell curve in terms of size, but that bell curve is reasonably manageable. So the rough answer to your question is, yep, they're all about the same amount. And it would be, 2 people for a day, something like that, if you averaged it out.
How many more slides we got here?
I think maybe none.
Good.
Just a couple, but these aren't important. Everybody knows these. I think by now everybody kind of understands when you can use Scrum. And if you stop and think about it, you can think about some situations where Scrum might not be the most useful thing. Highly chaotic environments, no support from management, constant change, situations that just aren't manageable at all. Scrum isn't going to work all that well either until you want to address some of those issues. We do know that it works best for software development. We like stable teams and empowerment. And of course, you have to have plannable work. We've talked about the benefits of Scrum. Oh, look, they're the same as the benefits for Agile. I wonder how that happened. But we talked about that before. There's just a quick reminder. And don't forget that word potential up at the top. That means you might get it, you might not. You have to make sure that it happens correctly. And that is the end of the story.
All right, we're going to lightning round here in just a second, but I want to give Mr. Pino time to jump in and plug the next one of these.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for today's session. It was a great one, so thank you, Allens. The next presentation will be on the basics of Kanban, part 1, which will be tomorrow, November 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, that's November 13th, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And while we go into the lightning round of questions, I do want to plug the Agile COP. Feel free to sign up on the link that's been posted to the chat box feature. And then also visit us on digital.gov, and you can get a chance to take a look at our previous questions or previous events, which I'm plugging into the chat box right now.
All
And
right.
last but not least, I'm so sorry, Allens.
That's all right.
We love getting the feedback, so we're plugging in one more link into the chat box feature where we ask that you provide your feedback to the presentation today. And that's all I got, Allens.
All right.
I want Jeopardy music.
A momentary indulgence. Anybody in the TTS Slack, please feel free to ping Ashley Wickman and tell her I'm running late for our 3 o'clock. Ready, Doc?
Yeah.
All right. How long are sprint planning meetings usually, or how long is too long?
An hour.
When we review yesterday's work and today's work, it can create tangents like mini demos or QA convos. How do you avoid that elegantly?
We don't review work during the sprint. We talk about what we've done, but we don't really review the work. Nothing substantive happens in the daily Scrum meeting, if that's what the question, I'm inferring that's what the question is.
I think it's how do you keep people from running down that rabbit hole when somebody talks about what they did yesterday? Just make sure they know you got 5 words. Let's keep moving.
Yeah, you are a skilled and artful and yet somehow polite and respectful Scrum Master.
I will pitch in on helping you with that, Colin, if you need more details. From Teresa, can you do/tell a short story, sample, or bite size? Teresa, I might need some detail on that if you want to unmute.
It was just at the point of saying you could cut user stories in half or a third. So like, how?
So the quickest answer is look up story splitting on the web, and you will find more than you ever thought could possibly be known about how to do that. Very
good.
From friend of the show, Randy Hart, what's the difference between a Scrum Master and an Agile coach?
So an Agile coach is an Agile coach knows how to diagnose the performance of the Scrum Master and her team. So an Agile coach is a more consultative role. They know what's going on, and they're able to suggest corrective actions for a team and for a Scrum Master. So it's a kind of a more experienced and wider perspective role.
The Scrum Master, Randy, will help you too. They won't be the pain in the butt coach like me and Dr. Atlas, who will just say, hey, yeah, good question. Good luck with that. Last one for you, Professor, from John. There are many ways teams tend to manage epics, from GitHub labels, using a catch-all issue, referencing small issues, or developing a roadmap or a wiki or a markdown to capture broad, long lead goals. What are some of the best practices you've seen for managing those? For example, a good practice or process for breaking down into actionable items in conjunction with managing the bigger picture.
So again, this team that I'm working with has done two things along those lines. One is that at one of their meetings, I forget which one it is, they have a separate backlog of epics. And so they will actually review that backlog, and that review will lead to them splitting out, again, story splitting, because epics are huge stories. And so you split out smaller stories to try to get that epic done. And so it's just keeping the epics in a place where you can just review them. You're at kind of a different level, and then splitting out workable user stories for the team to work on works really well. There are online tools that will tell you if an epic has been split into 22 stories, how many stories have been completed, and therefore what percentage of that epic has been done. A little over the top, but it does make things manageable and trackable, and it makes managers happy. So it's worth doing just for that.
All right. We are a little bit over. Thank you for the patience, everybody. We will see you tomorrow for Intro to Kanban Part 1.
Thank you all.